Welcome to Green Hills, Shadow. Chapter 4, Saturday Morning of Greetings. Shadow didn't know what to do. He wasn't obviously held down or restrained by anything, but he couldn't help this feeling due to his own experience by human hands. Despite his power, despite what he was, humans always found a way to hurt and humiliate him. Knuckles seemed to be willing to stand this human, but just because he wasn't cruel to the red symbiont doesn't mean Shadow himself would get the same treatment. But he's still currently processing Knuckles calling the human father. Like, what in the world? Maybe if he plays dead, the human won't try anything?
Yeah, like that would work.
Father, slowly.
He heard Knuckles say. The human stopped midway getting up from his mattress, obviously giving him an eyebrow. But then he saw Shadow, blue eyes locked on himself, and surprise on the human's face. Shadow laid absolutely still from his position. He could feel his hackles go up. He gripped the blankets rather hard at this point, and maybe his heart really was in his throat. It felt like it.
Oh, hey, buddy.
Shadow stared in disbelief at his friendly tone, but obviously he himself was still quite nervous, and if he was honest, felt dread. He could feel the bile rise again, but that human just smiled at him, relief on his face.
How are you feeling? It was quite a nasty shock you gave us.
He stated, straightening himself up, albeit slowly as Knuckles told him to. But Shadow did not answer him back. He couldn't. His words were stuck, and quite honestly, he didn't want to communicate with a human. But this one seemed undeterred, waiting on him to speak. So silence. Awkward silence. Well, besides the blue hedgehog snoring. So the human cleared his throat.
Okay then, I'll just get breakfast started. Would you like any?
Shadow's ears twitched. Why ask him? He looked to Knuckles for some guidance, if he's quite honest. Bafflement on his face, maybe overwhelmed at the sudden audience of this human father? How does that even work exactly? Knuckles picked up on his expression, and his own softened at Shadow. Why that too? Is it pity? Far too many expressions for Shadow, that's for sure.
Something like a soft pancake to start with, Father, or maybe some toast to begin with. He is still recovering from his injuries.
I can do that. Just let me change his bandages quick first. Keep them fresh.
He then began to make his way over to Shadow, still slow to Knuckles' advice. Shadow felt his breathing fasten, eyes shrieking. Should he let the human near him? But unable to hold it back, Shadow let out a very feral snarl at the human. Ears tilted back, hackles rising in an attempt to look threatening, and a few golden and red sparks edged at his fingers. Unbeknownst to Shadow, his eyes became much more bright red, like a fire inside of a ruby gem. He definitely looked threatening to him and Knuckles, looking like a feral animal. The human stopped, looking very surprised, and eyes were very wide. Perhaps even the aura Shadow was giving off. That he would harm the human, because he absolutely would. Knuckles, however, was not happy and stood in front of Shadow, keeping his sight on himself then the human.
Do not dare. You will not touch him.
Shadow's lip curled at Knuckles, who did not back down.
I told you before, he is not harmful, not to us. That also includes you. I like you, Hedgehog, but you will not touch my father.
The human did not make a move. Concern written his face, and he didn't speak either. Knuckles stared Shadow down, neither budging. Shadow growled angrily, maybe at himself for allowing this creature in his walls. The anger began to rise, but he saw Knuckles' hand reach out, and Shadow pushed himself back onto the thing he was on, a little more, out of reflex, and snarled again, expecting to be struck for his insolence. But that did not happen. Knuckles took notice at that. His eyes softened.
Hedgehog, I assure you, no, I promise you, my father would never hurt you.
His eyes held certainty in them that stopped Shadow snarling. The sincerity in Knuckles' expression and tone, the symbiont kept his hand at bay. Shadow could vaguely see the human watching them.
I do not know what you have gone through, but if you cannot trust my father, then trust me. He brought you here to make sure you were okay. Both my parents looked after you.
Shadow blinked, the fire in his eyes dimming, some hearing that. Knuckles took a deep breath.
My honor as a warrior, this I promise you. I tell you no falsehoods.
Shadow searched Knuckles' eyes and facial expression, and the doubt was still in his heart and mind, but from the moment this one called Knuckles found him awake, he had done nothing bad to him. He was patient and gentle. He wasn't quite used to that, not anymore. He wants to trust him. He just finds it difficult to. Why trust when that could be broken? Yet Shadow being exposed to falsehoods and liars for a long time, he knew when someone was lying. But this one did not have that. The sparks disappeared from his fingers. He swallowed tightly and tried to calm his beating heart. Maybe he can trust this once, but he's still not gonna say a word around the humans. And the blue one is still snoring. He simply let out a small nod and relaxed his once threatening stance. Knuckles also relaxed his stance but kept facing the hedgehog.
Father, please introduce yourself.
The human who kept quiet and watched the interaction they both had seemed even more surprised at Knuckles' suggestion.
Well, I'm Thomas Wachowski, but feel free just to call me Tom Bud.
He gave a small wave, but Shadow didn't acknowledge him. His eyes were on his own dulled rings, but his ears moved in his direction. So he knows where the Wachowski came from now.
May I introduce you to him?
And with that, Shadow gulped. Yep, the bile is coming back.
I will not unless I have your consent, my friend.
Knuckles stated, and again shocking Shadow. When is the last time someone cared about what he thought and said? It was all too much for him to think about. He simply nodded again, just wanting to be done with this.
Father, this is Shadow. He is rather resistant because he is in a strange place, so I ask you to be understanding.
Shadow wishes he had a way with words, absent-mindedly fiddled with his dull inhibitor rings, missing the gold sheen that used to come with it. Tom smiled.
That's okay. I suppose if I was on Mobius, I'd be the same.
Shadow's ears twitched at that.
Hello, Shadow. Good to have a name to call you by. It definitely fits.
No response.
Well, would you like your bandages changed by Knuckles?
No, he didn't want people touching him just yet, so he shook his head, still not looking at Tom. He seemed to understand.
Alright then, Knuckles, I'll go get started. Could you maybe inform your mom about this? Just so we, don't have a repeat?
He's honestly surprised no one woke up from the altercation. Knuckles let out a sound like he acknowledged him, so Tom left the room to go into the kitchen and get started on breakfast. If he was a little honest, what happened actually terrified him for the moment. Knuckles got up.
Breakfast will awaken the people around us. You don't have to speak, but no one will harm you. Fair warning though, my blue brother here can be challenging. I ask you not to sock him in the face.
Shadow couldn't help but feel his own lips go upright at the sides just a little bit. He certainly had a way of breaking through to Shadow.
Are you
He paused, making sure Tom wasn't around, and snuck a glance at him.
like me?
He asked. Knuckles tilted his head at him, with a questioning look on his face, as if he was trying to understand.
Like you?
A hedgehog?
He sees recognition in his purple eyes.
No. I am quite unsure on how you reached that conclusion, but I am an echidna.
Shadow was about to comment because he said the hedgehog was his brother. Looked curious now.
Have you never seen murals of my people? Or not heard tales about them?
Shadow shook his head. He isn't sure how to say where he came from.
Well, our civilization is in ruins now, but remains of my people are merely legends or stories. Perhaps I shall give you some lessons if we have the time.
Shadow heard a shuffle. It seems the woman is beginning to awaken. ever reminding him of human presence, and the smell of something entered his nose. The breakfast thing, maybe?
Morning, Mother.
She sat up and stretched her arms. She was wearing a white tank top with gray joggers on.
Morning, baby. How did you sleep? Any of your brothers up?
No, Tails will be awake shortly. However, I can't be certain how Sonic will get up. He's currently being an overgrown starfish.
That made the woman giggle. She grinned at him, but she spotted Shadow, who fiddled with his ring, actually sneaking a glance at her. She smiled at him. Again. Why? She was much like the man from before, Tom.
Well, good morning to you as well. How are you feeling?
She asked, and she got herself up. He took Knuckles' advice, keeping his mouth closed. He wouldn't even know what to say. He hasn't spoken to a human, at least not properly, in a long time. She didn't like that he didn't respond, but Knuckles came to his rescue.
Mother, our friend is shy. He was the same with Father, so I ask for your understanding on this.
Shadow let out a stutter-like sound. Shy was not the word Shadow would have used.
Oh, well, I suppose that's natural. You wouldn't see people like us on your home planet.
Well, she couldn't be more wrong, since Shadow himself was a sort of Earthling. He didn't come from Mobius, but he didn't exactly come from Earth either. But out of the two, Earth is supposedly his home planet.
As for how he is, he has had some water, and Father has started breakfast. Ah yes, but of course before we move on. This is my mother, Madeline Wachowski.
Maddie would do fine.
She nodded and waved to him, waiting to see if he'd speak up. He saw Knuckles' eyes ask for permission, and so Shadow just nodded at him and kept his eyes on her. Of course, both her and Tom did not read the way Knuckles did. Shadow wonders if they simply forgot.
And Mother, this is Shadow.
And with that, she smiled more.
A fitting name. It suits you.
Then the golden creature moved, making Shadow sort of jump, eyes wide with surprise. Knuckles chuckled and saw his bewildered look.
That is Ozzy. He is a dog and arch rival to the Mailman. He isn't a sepia like us. Do not worry though, Ozzy. We will train you to better him yet.
Cranberry? No. Just no.
Shadow wondered who was Cranberry. Deacon let out an undignified gasp.
Mother, I am a warrior. Such a nickname is unfitting for me.
Ah, it's a nickname Knuckles has. But that's another question for Shadow to ask. What was a cranberry?
Uh-huh.
Ozzy bumped his nose against Knuckles and began to wag his tail, begging for pets, and despite the embarrassment, he obliged. Sonic still out like a light.
Yes, I'm blue.
Knuckles shook his head.
I questioned his dreams. Even in sleep's warmth and embrace, he talks.
He kept petting the retriever, who was loving the attention. Maddie let out a small laugh.
Just one of his many talents.
Shadow watched her make her way to the fox he had forgotten about and gave him a kiss on the head. He watched with interest. The kid made an incoherent sound. Then the dog-nosed Shadow was awake and licked his hand, scaring him out of his watchful eye of the human, and he pulled away from the sudden wetness and gave Ozzy a very questionable look.
Ah, that is Ozzy's way of greeting you, Hedgehog.
Knuckles stated, giving Ozzy another pat on the head, who loved it.
He cannot express by talking, so he does that instead. He likes you.
He felt the dog's tail whack into the thing he was laying on. Shadow must have looked confused at the word like. How could the dog like him when they've never even met until now?
Ozzy is a simple-minded creature, Shadow. He cannot think like us, but still treat him with respect and he will do the same back to you.
Maddie watched the exchange, seeing how Shadow wouldn't speak up, but Knuckles seemed to have understood the hedgehog. It certainly only gave her more questions about our current guest, but it warmed her heart how her oldest was being. He was the same way with Tails, gentle and patient. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Shadow must have gone through something similar to Knuckles, considering his injuries and restraints. Was he captured by bounty hunters and used like an exhibit to attract people? And maybe was unfortunate enough to bump into a bad human or two before Coral found him? It would explain his unwillingness to converse with her and his nervous facial expressions. This kid was in serious need of some TLC. She felt Tails stir.
Mom,
Hey, baby, were you comfortable on that last night?
She ruffled his fringe gently, causing Tails to protest tiredly. His eyes squinted open at her, and his two tails began to strain out from being a cover on him.
yep, what time is it?
He asked, going on his knees on the beanbag chair, and began to stretch his limbs, much like an actual fox would. It was absolutely adorable to Maddie. She snuck a glance at the wall clock.
Just past 8:30. I'll go help your dad get the food ready.
She looked to Shadow, who wasn't paying any attention to anything but Knuckles and Ozzy at the current time. So she whispered to Tails.
Our friend is awake, but he's shy. Could you try to make sure Sonic doesn't overwhelm him when he wakes up?
Tails' eyes lit up at the responsibility and nodded, his two tails wagging. Oh, she will die of cuteness one of these days. Her poor heart. She gave him another ruffle and made her way out of the living room to speak to Tom about the situation. Tails turned and knew his Shadow, who felt the fox stare, and set his red gaze on him. Tails was in awe. He had red markings in his eyelids, but it was his red eyes that stunned him. He rarely saw people with red eyes, but none could ever hold a candle to this guy. Though dulled, it was like seeing a red gem. Knuckles took notice of his brother's movements.
Good morning, brother.
Shadow blinked and gave Knuckles another look that shouted, "What?" Tails, though, hurriedly got up and made his way towards them both, being mindful of Sonic's ever-moving form in his sleep.
Wow, hi, my name is Miles Tails per hour. Well, it's Wachowski now, but I'd prefer if he'd just call me Tails.
Shadow looked like he could bolt from the fox's sudden attention, and Tails waited for him to introduce himself, but he didn't respond. Knuckles pulled Tails back ever so slightly, gaining the kid's attention on himself.
Careful. Sonic's arms are deadly to your fragile legs.
I don't think a simple hint from Sonic is going to shatter my knees, Knuckles.
Shadow saw the two tails flick behind the fox. That was so interesting to him. He's seen Earth foxes in pictures, but never ones with two tails. Perhaps it was a Mobian thing? He could only guess. But he wonders if it's a sensitive subject. Tails saw his line of sight and deflated a little, his twin tails going still, and he rubbed his arm self-consciously.
Yeah, I know they're not nice to look at. I'm sorry if it makes you uncomfortable.
That made Shadow and Knuckles pause and look at the kid. It looks like he misunderstood the Black Hedgehog. Knuckles was unsure if Shadow would speak to the fox, considering he weren't with either of his adoptive parents. He was about to open his mouth to explain, but didn't get the chance to, because Shadow decided to, surprising the echidna.
No, I'm not uncomfortable.
His voice was soft and quiet, unsure how to respond, but pushed on, almost a matter-of-fact tone.
If anything, I'm fascinated. They look cool.
It seems it was uncommon on the fox's planet. He snuck a brave glance at the echidna before looking at Tails once more, who in return was stunned. Normally his two tails, with the exception of Sonic and Knuckles, was frowned upon, like a bad omen, a curse. This hedgehog is much like them, unbothered by his mutation. It's not something he was used to, and he was secretly worried about how he would react. He just did not expect the newcomer to be curious about it at all. It wasn't in his bingo book. Knuckles smiled, however.
See, brother, your two tails are a gift.
He patted the fox's shoulder affectionately.
Ah, yes.
He looked to Shadow, who wondered what Knuckles wanted him to do.
My brother has introduced himself. Shall I do the same courtesy back, or are you alright to give it a try?
Tails' ears twitched towards Knuckles. Shadow turned a little red in the cheeks. He forgot about that, and his ears went a little flat.
Shadow.
He muttered, fingers running across his ring, obviously a little bit mortified. But Tails didn't comment about it. Instead, he smiled.
Hi there, Shadow. I'm happy you woke up, though. You did scare our parents and Wade.
Wade? Who's Wade? Shadow gave both of them a questioning look. Knuckles saw it and decided to explain.
Wade works with our father. Both of their duty is to protect this town and its people. They brought you here so you could have medical attention from our mother. She is a healer.
Ozzy decided to flop himself onto Sonic's body, who barely flinched in his sleep, causing Tails to giggle at his brother's very tangled mess, but proceeded to give belly rubs to the dog.
Great, another human. Wonderful.
Shadow thought, though it seems Ozzy set a button off on Sonic.
Not the chili dogs!
He shouted out, suddenly scaring the ever daylights out of Shadow, making his fur frazzle and stick up on all ends. The blue hedgehog sat up suddenly, making Ozzy roll onto the mattress, who did not at all seem fazed. Neither did Knuckles, but Tails certainly looked somewhat startled, his twin tails puffing out slightly. Knuckles did not look impressed and gave the hedgehog what Shadow could see, a very judging stare.
Do I want to know, brother?
He simply said, his tone of "I'm used to this nonsense." Sonic didn't have the decency to look sorry.
Knuckles, it was horrible. Egghead, all my chili dogs were smashed. Rip.
Sonic must have known Tails was watching him because he started snorting and covering his mouth with his fist from the sheer silliness of it, taken in by his blue brother's way of storytelling. They could hear Knuckles mutter something about a curse, something about unfortunate timing and how it follows Sonic. Shadow, though, could feel his heart beating loudly. What is it with this family making his heart race? He's lost count of how many times it's happened since he's been here. But even he almost snorted at Knuckles' facial expression and tone. He did like the echidna, he supposes.
Sonic, you have startled our guest.
Never mind, Shadow began to hate him. Stop paying attention on him. And with that, the hedgehog spun around so fast, green eyes wide at Shadow. Shadow could just feel the heart attack coming on. Just let him die from it now, please, he said in a silent prayer to himself. He saw Sonic open his mouth to speak and braced himself, but instead of Knuckles, it was the fox who jumped to his rescue from the sudden attention.
Shadow, this is Sonic.
Tails pulled Sonic's shoulders against his legs with a smile. The hedgehog looked up at the kid with a grin of his own. It was full of affection.
Morning, bro. His name is Shadow? We really have literal names, don't we? Well, as Tails said, I'm Sonic Wachowski, dashing hedgehog hero and fastest thing alive, at your service.
He put his hand out to shake Shadow's, often noticing the blank stare at Sonic's hand, unsure of what he was to do with it. Oh boy,
Where has this guy been? Living under a rock?
Sonic thought to himself. None of them seemed to have noticed, but Knuckles' amethyst eyes softened yet again in understanding. He cleared his throat, gaining their attention.
He is attempting a greeting, Shadow. You shake his hand with your own.
Shadow mimicked Knuckles from earlier, lightly tapped his fist against his chest. It baffled Sonic, and Tails looked giddy from seeing someone else follow his older brother's custom. Knuckles thought he would have shook the blue hedgehog's hand, but pleasantly surprised at Shadow's attempt number 2. Sonic withdrew his hand.
He's corrupted him.
He bemoaned, earning a scowl from the echidna, but chose to ignore it.
Don't you dare mock.
So anyway, Shadow,
Sonic interrupted the echidna and put his hands together.
how are you feeling? I hope Knucklehead didn't bore you. Oh, how are you finding it here anyway? Actually, no. How long have you been here? Like, on this planet? Oh,
Sonic, breathe. His head will explode from the overload of questions. Sorry, Shadow. He's just excited to meet another hedgehog like himself.
Shadow had no idea how to answer any of his questions and wasn't sure if he wanted to. Of course, his mouth spoke before his brain could catch up.
I thought his name was Cranberry.
Oh, Sonic likes this hedgehog. Knuckles stuttered, muzzle going as red as his fur, and Sonic laughed. Tails joined in as well. It confused Shadow, but the sound did feel quite nice to his ears. It felt normal, if he was being honest.
Boys, we'll be having breakfast in the living room. So mind coming to help?
He heard Tom call out. He then heard a whistle, and Ozzy made his way to his owners. One moment Sonic was there, the next a breeze was felt. Shadow saw the hedgehog was no longer against the yellow fox. His head shot up in alarm from his position. Tails shook his head.
That's just Sonic. He's really fast.
He heard Tom lightly scold the hedgehog, not wanting to accidentally bump into him while holding a plate or risking falling over Ozzy. No kidding. He heard the hedgehog say fastest thing alive, but Shadow thought out of all the people around him, he was. Knuckles let out a tut-like sound and left to go into the kitchen, but Tails pulled his beanbag chair over closer to the thing Shadow was on.
Did you sleep okay though? The couch is pretty comfortable.
Couch? So that's what he was lying on. It wasn't a bed.
You don't talk much, do you?
Tails pointed out, and Shadow laid his head back on the soft pillow he had been on, contemplating if he should say to the fox, or just keep quiet. But that would have been rude, wouldn't it?
I was normally not allowed to.
He whispered, unable to really look at him from the admittance. Tails' light blue eyes widened, progressing what Shadow said to him.
By whom?
Tails asked, taken aback by it. Shadow's ears pinned back with a pained expression on his face.
Never mind.
He uttered quietly and looked away. With that sentence, Tails went quiet, mouth opening and closing like he was trying to figure out what he just heard. Sonic came back with Tails' breakfast of bacon, eggs, and a pancake, sat on the wooden table before disappearing again. Tails silently thanked the blue hedgehog, if anything, to distract his mind from what just transpired. Then the hedgehog came back, same speed, and promptly sat his back against the bottom of the couch, holding his plate with the wooden tray and crossed his legs. This must be the breakfast Knuckles talked about. The smell was strong for Shadow, and not in a good way. His stomach growled, and he gritted his teeth together, absent-mindedly putting his hand on his stomach, being mindful of his laceration, willing to calm it. He feels like he should just go back to sleep.
Shadow?
His ears twitched, and he briefly looked up to see Knuckles and Tom.
Hey, sorry, didn't want us all to having food in the kitchen while you're still recovering, so we'll have it here for today.
Tom said. Maddie had made her way into the living room with her own tray and sat near Tails on her own mattress, since the couch was preoccupied. Who asked if they could put on morning cartoons to watch while they ate. Cartoon? Shadow wondered. Knuckles stood, holding out a tray, while Tom held two. Now he was even more confused, and it must have shown on his face.
You don't want anybody?
Tom asked Shadow. He could feel Maddie's eyes on him as well as about everyone else, and he could feel his face flush with heat from the intention. He pursed his lips, unsure on why they want to give him food. He doesn't feel like he has the right to reject. He looked to Knuckles, hoping he could translate or offer guidance.
Do you need help sitting up?
He offered. No, Shadow doesn't think he does. He let out a groan, trying to figure out how to ask the question. He still isn't willing to talk around either human, so he's not got a choice. He shifted his body up, forcing himself to sit up against his pillow on the couch, with Knuckles at the ready to help, but didn't make a move unless Shadow gives him the okay. Once he was seated up for the first time since he's been there, Knuckles put the tray onto his lap and took a tray off of Tom, presumably his own one. He then sat underneath Shadow, just like the blue hedgehog did, and Tom went to join Maddie. Shadow took his plate and swallowed. He didn't know what the heck was on it. Some of it looked like the rest of theirs, but the only thing he could make out was the bread, and it was crispy. What exactly was the light brown round thing next to it? Then he heard a noise and he twisted his head to find the source. It came from a black box. It was long though, thin, and the pictures moved. Oh, is it a film projector? But where was it projecting from? He took a long look around the room, taking in everything, if anything, to find the thing.
Okay, we got some classic choices here for cartoons. Popeye?
Tom mentioned details. Sonic neighed.
But that's super old.
So is Looney Tunes, yet you like it all the same.
Wacky races?
Maddie suggested. Tails looked over his options. All of them were good.
What about the Flintstones?
He suggested, and Tails looked up.
Is that the one with the cave people? I shall extend my hand for that one.
Course you would. Shame no Tom and Jerry.
Too early for that, Blueberry.
Maddie sipped her mug. Is that Sonic's nickname?
Flintstones then? Shadow, are you alright with that?
She asked while Tom put on the cartoon, seeing him glance around the room and leaving her confused. He felt her gaze and he huffed, looking back at his plate, not acknowledging her. Yeah, he definitely needed TLC in her opinion. She wasn't offended by him not responding to her, but all he was doing is adding more questions to her ever-growing list. Tom shook his head. Knuckles seemed to understand him well enough. It did make him wonder though. Was he unwilling to talk to him and Maddie, but not to Tails or Sonic? If anything, just withdrawn? Is it because he and Maddie are humans, and he is unsure on how to handle them? Like Maddie and Tom had his own list of questions he wanted to ask. Everyone began to dig into their breakfast and watching the cartoon, with Tails laughing at Fred's voice at certain times. Tom pried away the maple syrup from Sonic so he didn't overload his pancakes with it. As the minutes ticked by, Tom noticed Shadow did not make a move in trying his own food. If anything, it looked like he was studying it. Has this kid really never had a pancake? He honestly sometimes wants to throttle all the adults back on their home planet at times.
You have ruined the pancake, Hedgehog. That syrup stuff is far too sweet.
Oh yeah, Mr. I Love Grapes 24/7? Do you see me judging you on your taste?
Constantly.
Knuckles flatly said, earning a storm from Tails, whose Sonic shot a look at that shouted traitor.
Shadow, how's the toast?
Tom calmed out while taking a bite of his own. He wasn't expecting the answer, but wanted to include him anyway. He snuck a glance and saw untouched food still. He frowned, and he sees Shadow turn his head at Tom.
I know you're probably sore to eat, but I would be more at ease if you at least had a slice of toast, even just a few bites. Get your strength up, you know?
He said to the black hedgehog, who frowned at Tom before looking back at his plate, studying it once more. Knuckles turned his head back toward Shadow.
Father is good at pancakes.
He pointed towards the round fluffy food. Ah, so that's what they are called. Tom saw his ears twitch forward at what Knuckles said. Tom wasn't offended the hedgehog was hesitant about taking a bite. He probably wasn't hungry, but still, he needed at least to try a little, and he turned his attention to the cartoon with Maddie. Of course, Tom didn't realize the reason for Shadow's hesitation is because he wasn't sure if the food was laced with something. Shadow knew he wouldn't do it to his own family members, but he himself was free game. He had to remind himself what Knuckles said and what he promised, but Tom would never hurt him. It was still hard to resist because of the years he had with humans. He shakily took the toast into his hand and bit into it with great hesitation. He felt the crunch, and despite it being cold, the taste was alright. Shadow couldn't remember the last time he was given food, at least not without it being contaminated with something. He could feel emotion stirring inside of him. His eyes violently threatened to water, and he let out a small whimper from the memories, and just all the care thus far. He couldn't contain it, which gained Tom's attention.
Shadow?
He called out, causing Shadow to flinch. He could feel Sonic's attention and Knuckles' well. He could feel just about everyone's. Oh, he wishes he could just hide, and so he shut his eyes tightly so he didn't have to see them. Tom paused, seeing the expression, and in turn looked at Maddie, who had the same aching feeling in her heart. So Tom cleared his throat.
Boys, just focus on the TV, okay? Let Shadow eat in peace.
Tom said in a tone that wasn't to be argued. Shadow swallowed the lump, not expecting him to be considerate or the others listening, but they did. He felt Knuckles tap the couch with his mitt in an assuring way before continuing his breakfast. The black hedgehog looked towards the screen, still wondered where the film projector was, but willing to keep distracted and not focused on his rising emotions. And he ate the toast. He does suppose he could try and pretend to be normal.